So we're now going to hear a presentation on behalf of the New York State Homes and Community Renewal organization, led by Woody Pascal, the Deputy Commissioner for Rent Administration. Good morning and welcome, Deputy Commissioner. You have quite a team with you. We appreciate that. Perhaps you could introduce them to us.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Woody Pascal, and I'm the Deputy Commissioner for New York State Homes and Community Renewal's Office of Rent Administration. First, let me begin by saying I look forward to continuing to work with all of you. We've had a great relationship, and I also want to welcome your new board members. Congratulations to all of you. The city of our greatly benefits from selfless public servants such as all of yourselves. We appreciate you, and on behalf of Commissioner Ruth Ann Visnaskis, we thank you and again welcome you. So before I go into my remarks, let me introduce to you my colleagues who are going to protect me just in case things go awry. I'll start on my right, my special and senior advisor, Michael Berrios, who works very closely with the RGB board. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. On my immediate right, John Lance, who is the Bureau Chief for the Overcharge and Luxury Decontrol Bureau. On my immediate left, Guy Alba, Assistant Commissioner. On his left is my special counsel, Daniel Savory, and on the far left, our newest member of our team, our Deputy Director of Luxury Decontrol, Overcharge, and Rent Control, Petition for Administrative Review Unit. That's a lot to say all at one shot. James Ferreira. Thank you. Okay. So, Madam Chair, members of the board, as the Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Rent Administration, I thank each of you for the opportunity to both provide you with an update on recent activities at the Office of Rent Administration and for allowing New York State Homes and Community Renewal to be part of the process leading to the promulgation of this year's guidelines for rent-stabilized apartments. First, let me begin by talking a little about major capital improvements, also known as MCIs. MCIs are important improvement or installation that improves the overall condition of a building that is subject to rent regulation. The MCI work must be for the operation, preservation, or maintenance of that building. For example, the replacement of a roof or a new boiler. The owner can only charge for the MCI, a permanent rent increase to tenants, after they receive approval from the Office of Rent Administration, after meeting clearly a certain criteria. What we've heard from community-based organizations and other interested parties over the last, let's say, year or so, was that we needed to make some adjustments. In particular, we decided that we needed to enhance our orders and create a frequently asked questions for tenants about MCI rent increase applications. We also, again talking to advocates and other individuals, extended the time frame for tenants in order to respond to notices that they receive from us from 30 days to 40 days. Then we also began to look at our bulletins. So we created operational bulletin number 2017, which serves to provide guidance to owners and tenants of rent-regulated apartments on how ORA will review an owner's application for a major capital improvement, rent increase, relative to the issues of the cost of the qualifying improvement. This operational bulletin also gives guidance on the type of documentation required to substantiate the actual cost of the improvement. Then we began to look at individual apartment improvements. So we revised our operational bulletin on that. Now, an IAI, as we call it, is when an owner is allowed to charge both current and new tenants more monthly rent if the landlord wants to renovate the apartment. Owners do not get permission to do IAI increases if the apartment is vacant. If the apartment is not vacant, the owner has to ask the current tenant to sign some type of document. This bulletin also gives guidance to owners and tenants on how ORA will review the installation of IAIs when a complaint for rent overcharge has been filed or is an investigation with respect to IAI installations. One of the components that we do look at now is cash payments over $10,000 for IAIs, which may require additional information regarding source of funds. ORA continues to reserve the right to request such information no matter what amount of cash is involved when circumstances are required. Then also in 2017, we began to look at the J51 tax abatement program, which is administered by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and units that have failed to register back within our system. Our goal has always been with owners is to ensure that all rental apartments are correctly registered and that the tenants enjoy the rights and privileges that rent regulations confer. As part of our ongoing compliance efforts, landlords who are not following the law will be subject to a full range of measures available at ORA. ORA's J51 initiative has spurred the registration of thousands of improperly deregulated units. Owners who did not respond and or failed to voluntarily register have been subject to formal proceedings that have resulted in apartments being returned to regulation, in some case, monetary penalties. In addition, we've worked with HPD on its ongoing initiative to ensure that all buildings that receive 421A tax benefits are properly registered with ORA. ORA has developed with HPD updated registration instructions for buildings that receive 421A tax benefits, and in the past year that has resulted in improved and more complete registrations in over 2,500 buildings. And when we did this, we also consulted with owner groups. So we've also now done a lot of work in terms of strengthening our outreach efforts by sending staff out to provide information and to speak at various forums at about 35 meetings last year. These meetings are held with our partners in government and various elected officials. In addition, our public information offices have been working on an average of providing 3,000 apartment rent histories to tenants each month. ORA works with various legal aid offices, community-based organizations, various city agencies throughout the city, and provides them with rent information on a weekly basis as they're being representing tenants in court proceedings. Also, the Public Information Office has worked on developing, translating over 22 documents into various languages, including our lease writer, so that tenants can better know their rights. And as always, our rent information hotline continues to provide translation services. Now, as I've mentioned a few times since I've been here, and this is my 8th one, so we are finally, and I can't stress it enough, finally working on the modernization project, replacing the 34-year-old historic update tracking system, our case processing system. And as one can imagine, it is a daunting, demanding, intricate process that involves significant members of the staff. They're very happy to be in Manhattan today, so I don't have to meet with the vendors today. And it has been daunting and very difficult, and I know that they're going to be speaking to you eventually again soon. We're working hard at that task with also the folks at the Information Technology Services, and we're hoping that we're going to have a very successful end of the project sometime this year. And lastly, I want to finally acknowledge what I haven't done while I've been here, the hardworking women at the Office of Rent Administration, 300 plus, that serve the needs of the 2 million or so rent-regulated tenants, as well as subject rent-regulated building owners. They work very hard to do a good job to provide a service for people who need us, whether it's a tenant or owner, and I'm very proud of the work that they do, so I just wanted to acknowledge them. And lastly, I want to say ORA is applauding the city's efforts, in particular our partners in government that work to protect tenants and work with owners to view them as an important partner in maintaining a viable rent-regulated housing stock. No one agency can do this alone, and we look forward to continuing to work with all of you, whether it's the New York City Housing Authority, the Office of Section 8, Department of Buildings, Department of Finance, Department of Tax and Finance, our friends at HPD on efforts to protect tenants with their respective powers of oversight, and the Attorney General's Office of subject agencies that have been aligned. And on behalf, again, of Commissioner Ruth Ann Visnaskis and HCR, we wish you success in your difficult deliberations and offer ORA's continued support. Oh, and we've been joined by Assistant Commissioner Simone Meeks. Have a seat right here.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I have a question in terms of the effort that you're making to identify buildings that have not properly registered. We asked a question about how many apartments or units we're talking about in terms of that effort, and it wasn't, the answer that we got referred us to another answer which it didn't, from my perspective, specify. So I wonder if you have any information on the number of apartments that you've successfully re-regulated or newly regulated.
Kathy, this is question 6?
Yeah, question 6, which refers to the answer to question number 2, but question number 2 doesn't address re-regulation.
Yeah, she's talking about this question. 6. Right here. You want to-
Okay. We're going to have to get the full breakdown from the J51 stuff and the 421A stuff, because we can get you a breakdown on that.
Okay, thank you.
I have maybe a series of questions, but if anyone wants to break in with other questions, feel free to. Just one question, the timeline on modernization, are you expecting, do you have a timeline as to when it's going to be complete? I know we talked about this last year, and I know it's complicated.
It's been much longer than we anticipated. Much longer than we anticipated. We're hoping for the end of the year.
Thank you. I just have a few questions relating to the answers to our questions. Let me just turn to the page. I'm looking at question 35. The renewal of the rent stabilization law in 2003 allowed owners to charge the legal registered rent upon renewal for those tenants who had been charged a preferential rent. How many units have gone from a preferential rent to the legal registered rent upon renewal since 2003? Conversely, how many preferential rents since 2003 are still preferential? And then I just didn't fully understand what the answer was responding to. So you say a minimum of 15,902 when you compare 2016 and 2017 rent registration data. So could you just explain exactly what that means, just so I have it clear? And then if there's any other additional information about those two questions, I'd appreciate to hear the answers to that as well.
Well, that's just a comparison between the 2 years of 2016 and 2017. Going back to what you asked for, it's a difficult task to go back and try to produce. That's something that will take quite a bit of time.
So just to understand, it's an answer to question. It's a partial answer to question, the first question, which is so 16,000 units went from preferential to the legal registered rent between 2016 and 2017. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, repeat that, I'm sorry.
So my understanding of the answer, and I just want to make sure it's correct, is that your response says that effectively 16,000 units went from preferential to legal rent from 2016 to 2017.
Well,
That's correct. That is correct.
Okay. And then it's hard to answer the second question. I'm asking, it's hard to answer the second question, how many preferential rents since 2003 are still preferential?
Correct.
yeah,
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Because the
thank
rent
you.
can go back to legal rent, it can go back down, it kind of goes in and out depending on the person.
I got it. Thank you.
Is it, on this note, thank you for your testimony, is it possible, though, to say how many preferential rents are in the 421A buildings versus the balance of the program? I mean, a lot of them are in the 421A buildings.
We-
How many are in the 421A program, preferential rents?
And then I just had a question on the April 11th letter with the supplemental questions that were, okay, so question 3, can DHCR determine the ratio of rent-regulated units to total units in each building? Can DHCR break that information down by borough? My understanding of the response is just saying how many rent-regulated and how many buildings there are. But can you answer the question of the ratio of an individual building of rent regulated to total units? Is that information that you can actually develop? It's in the April 11th letter from HCR, question 3. So it's not in the big letter, it's the kind of supplemental letter. Oh, sorry, it's the two-page response, not the long response.
Do we have that? I don't see it.
Oh, you know, I didn't see it in the packet, but I saw it in the in the email.
It's a privacy issue in terms of publishing rent registration information. So with regard to apartments that are not part of the rent, that are not rent registered with us, we couldn't provide you that information.
But so for instance, if there was, like, let's say, a building with 100 units and there were 30 units that were rent regulated, could you give us some kind of aggregate data that buildings in the, 100 plus units have, X percent of units are rent regulated? Is that something that you're able to generate, that number, without, implicating privacy concerns, because it would be across a class?
We'll look into it.
Thank you.
See if we can get you that information.
Thank you.
Okay.
And then question 4 of that same letter, the second question there is, how many 421A units became regulated in the most recent year, and how many exited regulation in that year? Oh, I'm sorry, no, you said that that has been answered. Oh, so part 2 of your question has already been answered in a submission from last year. So is it possible to update that information to the most current year, or you don't have that data yet?
I'm sorry, that's mistype in regard to the date. Refer to the content, the large case, the large Q&A, the multiple page Q&A has that data.
Okay, okay, thank you. In other response, and then just in terms of question 5, is that something that is that something that you can answer at some point, or it's just something that you don't have the data to answer?
When apartments exit rent regulation, we don't necessarily have the reason or the ability to track the reason why they exited, so we couldn't break it down like based on MCI, IEI, or vacancy. It would be something more like high rent vacancy decontrol or luxury decontrol or something like that.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Other questions? Yeah. Leah.
Sure. Thank you so much for all of this information. It's very helpful. I have a question that's a common scenario that I often see. A tenant who has a severe repair, like let's say, for example, a floor that's been sunken in, and the landlord repairs the floor, but then applies for an IAI as if the repair is a renovation. Do you have any protections for tenants who are experiencing landlords who are applying for a rent increase for something that's a repair and not a renovation or improvement?
Well, if it's an IAI, did the tenant sign off on it?
Sometimes the tenants...
And was there a service case related to the Office of Rent Administration?
Right, yeah.
So there's a service case that's related to us, to ORA?
Yes, so let's say that in the scenario it is. What I'm wondering is what are some of the protections that you've seen that would cover a tenant from getting a rent increase that's based on a repair and not a renovation?
If the tenant filed a service-related case with the Office of Rent Administration and we deemed that the service was not being provided, the owner would then have to come to us to say that they restored the service, and the rent potentially would go up based on the Rent Guidelines Board, because go back one guideline board, correct? Right. One guideline board. Then?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that generally repairs don't qualify for a rent increase. It would have to be a new item. So if it's a repair and that's borne out in the, I guess in the processing of the case, then they wouldn't be entitled to a rent increase. Am I right, Dan? James?
So
Yeah,
let,
I mean, if the tenant doesn't give his or her written consent to a new item, then the owner couldn't collect that increase, and that would be considered an overcharge. And the tenant would have to also, besides maybe the service complaint, would have to file a complaint of rent overcharge with the agency. Now, we have fact sheets, we have information, we have our hotline. So yes, the tenant would have to kind of know that.
Right.
File a complaint.
In addition, there's no mechanism for the owner to apply to us for that type of increase.
for an IAI?
For an IR.
They apply for MCI, but not for
They
IAI.
apply for MCI.
Right.
The reasons for not
I'm going to do that, yeah.
Even when the owner, let's say a tenant has had a stove for a very long time, and the owner replaces the stove is broken, and the owner replaces the stove.
In that situation, I mean, the tenant is entitled to a working stove. Now, many owners will try to put in a used refrigerator, and that would be fine if it's working. If there's no used refrigerator, or if the used refrigerator is so different in quality, then the owner would have to put in a new refrigerator at the owner's cost for an existing tenant. The tenant would not have to pay for that increase. But if it's a new item, it's a new appliance that the tenant never had, and the tenant gives his or her written consent, then the owner could then legally collect an increase based on the cost of that new item.
I'd like to go to your outreach efforts. One of the things that would be very helpful to us is if ORA could have someone present at our public hearings to address issues that come up that are within your jurisdiction. We are hoping this year to have a representative from HPD as well. As you probably can imagine, we get a lot of
Absolutely.
people
Let
testifying.
let me suggest maybe having someone from Department of Buildings also. I mean, we've seen a lot of issues with illegal conversions that are happening, especially in the outer boroughs. There have been some issues with the application process with them, and I think maybe owners and tenants would be very helpful, very appreciative of seeing them also. But we can get some folks out there. You're
Yeah,
going to do
we-
all the boroughs this year again?
We are. We can get you the, before. We can get you the schedule.
Okay, that'd be helpful.
That would be very helpful, because we do get a lot of tenants giving testimony that implicates issues that your office would be able to address, hopefully. Yes?
Yeah,
further
I
questions?
just had one follow-up question. So in terms of the two-page sheet, you said that the information for part 2 of question 4 was answered in the longer response, and I just skimmed through it and I can't find it. Could you just point me where the issue of how many 421A units became regulated in the most recent year and how many exited regulation in that year? Could you just point me to the question that responds to that, please?
Actually, Dave, we covered that in our changes report,
Okay.
so we can answer that
All right,
as
thank
well.
you.
So, yeah, we have that.
Okay, we're going to get an answer. You're off the hook on that one.
I have a question. Hi, on the issue of preferential rents, question 33, is your department in charge with proactively educating anyone on the harms of preferential rents? On the preferential rent question 33, I'm just, what actions or activities does your department do to educate folks on preferential rents and the potential harms?
Basically, it's fact-driven, and it depends on what the issues are happening. One of the challenges that we've seen in the local offices, we've got multiple offices throughout the city, is that most folks don't read their leases. It's troubling, because by the time they come to us, there's already been an action, or the owner said, we're going to change it, we want the legal regulated rent, and In some cases like Brooklyn, the difference between legal regulated rent and the preferential rent could be upwards of $500, $600. And then literally, they have their lease in front of them, and you see they signed preferential. We continue to try to work with community-based organizations to also, we've got a fact sheet on it. We've got a fact sheet on fees that we just did like 2 years ago, right, to address some issues that other organizations have talked to us about. It's very daunting and difficult to reach everyone. We're talking about a couple of million people. People move around a lot. And it's how can I say it? In a city like this, everyone knows 311. They call HPD or other government agencies, and they just don't really know who we are. But we're doing the best that we can to get out there.
I guess, though, just as a follow-up to that question, do you have I mean, in the buildings that I've ever seen, the preferential lease rider is in general in a fairly big font, and I mean, I don't want to minimize the question, but are you requiring the font size and how the lease document presents, or is that up the discretion of the owner?
Discretion of the owner.
Is that something that you're looking into? In other words,
yes,
requiring some form of a notice with respect to preferential
yes,
rents in the lease itself that is more accessible?
Upfront, yes, and including on the lease renewal.
And what's the status of that initiative?
It's in development. It's in development now.
What is do you have the statutory or regulatory authority to require landlords to use a particular lease form?
We do for the renewal.
Well, that would be a question. Because we could go through the code amendment process to create what we think should be good, but the rent stabilization law, the administrative code of the city of New York has already sometimes said what the look of a form should be, like the rent stabilization rider. So that would be an issue. We would probably assert we have that power, but the courts may have to weigh in later on.
I see. But if the courts weigh in, you would have to go through, either you wouldn't have the power, or you would just have to jump through more regulatory hoops to get there.
Well, it would be an issue of whether the agency itself could decree a certain form, because this would be in a lease, which traditionally has been not something that we dictate the terms on.
I see.
So that would be the question, whether we would have the power, or it would have to be the city council, or potentially the state legislature. Because maybe some advocates would say that that is more restrictive, and we have the Ertstat law, which says that greater regulation has to go through the state legislature. So that would be an interesting issue.
All right, well, we'll look forward to hearing about how that's progressing.
Just as a quick follow-up, thank you. The 30% figure filed in 2017, do you know if that's an increase compared to years prior? Do you have a sense of the longitudinal changes of that figure? That'd be great.
Great. It's a small increase over last year, but we have data that they've been answering that for about 10 years, so I can get you the preferential what they've done over, I think it's probably the last 10 years. You are. You'll get my bill. I just have one basic question, and you're welcome to avoid it if you'd like, but the impact of guidelines that have been rent freezes or lower guidelines than this board has historically done, can you say a general statement of how that's impacted other forms of increases owners can take? Because it's clear rents are still rising beyond what our board approves. And is there a general sense of the trend that you're seeing? Just, and I know that's not necessarily empirically based, but.
Well, I can tell you that with the zero guideline increases, we saw increases in tenant complaints with regard to lease renewals, because like you said, owners were were attempting to collect increases other ways. I think tenants who had preferential rents were losing those. And like Woody had alluded to earlier, certain tenants not quite understanding how the preferential rent might have worked would file a complaint with us. So we saw some upticks in lease renewal complaints, and we basically guessed that that was the causes of it, or the part of the cause of it. We don't have strict empirical data on that because we can't quite track what the complaints were for, but we noticed during that period that that's what happened. So.
And what about use of MCIs and IAIs? Are there trends that you're seeing in use of that program or those programs as a way of obtaining rent increases?
We don't track IAI stuff unless there's a formal complaint that comes in.
Okay.
The owner is allowed to do that if there's a vacancy in the apartment or if a tenant signs a form that allows him to do IAIs.
Okay.
On MCIs, it's been pretty consistent over the last at least 7 years in terms of the amount of money owners have applied for MCIs. Some of the issues that challenges we've seen with owners, like that Andrew mentioned earlier, changing of a boiler, going from fuel type 6 to natural gas or fuel 4 or 2, well, we didn't do 4, we didn't allow 4, right. But 2 and to natural gas, they're expensive. Building pointing, we've seen some huge numbers for building pointing. And it's this daunting what some of the tenants have to deal with in terms of how the MCI process.
But you haven't seen, in terms of the total amounts being applied for rent-stabilized buildings, you're not seeing an upward trend?
I think a lot of it deals with probably the labor costs that are attached to various permits that they have to get. I haven't seen a big change. It's been consistent, about $200 million for the last at least 5 or 6 years. It hasn't really changed much. The number of applications is about the same also.
I think it's question 25 in your...
Thank you.
The total amount applied for by owners in 2017 was actually, there was an uptick in 16, but it's now back to more, it seems like from year to year it varies.
I have a question about number, on the long form, number 39 and 40, just for clarification.
I can't hear you, Scott, sorry.
Questions number 39 and 40 on the long questionnaire. The 100, we hear in the testimony, you know, quite a lot of, I'm being harassed by my landlord. It's always, you know, hard to know what's factual and not factual. The 257 that's quoted here, are these all rent-regulated tenants, or these could be tenants in any housing market or rent-regulated?
They're all rent-regulated.
These are all
They have to be rent-regulated.
They had to be rent-regulated, okay. In the case of the 25%, so it says in general, there's 250 cases a year. If you took the ones that had no harassing conduct out, it's less than 200. I mean, I think if it's less than 200, every single one of these people come to our hearings. But of the 25% that nothing is found, what are the claims that are made?
It's a variety of different things. What we found is, many times, how can I say it, tenants and owners just have differences and they need someone to mediate. We serve that purpose for them, to mediate some of their cases.
I have a question going back to Andrew's question regarding changes that you saw with the rent freeze. I'm wondering for question 18, if regarding the total number of vacancy registrations, if you saw any changes, any increases or decreases in the vacancy registrations for the last couple of years. What impact maybe the rent freeze might have had on the number of people leaving apartments? 18. There's that first column, the total number of vacancy registrations. I think New York County is the highest.
We can go back and I'll get that data for you too. As long as that question's been there, we'll go back and we'll put it all side by side for you.
And then my second question is, I'm wondering if there's any data regarding the vacancy registrations on long-term tenancy vacancy registration. So for example, someone who has been in an apartment for 10 years or more.
We're not sure if we have that, but we'll look into it.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question too, kind of about long-term tenancy. In the data sets, and if you kind of look at Street Easy, you see this all the time in the co-ops that were converted in the 80s and early 90s, rent stabilized tenants who've stayed and tend to be in very large apartments. Is there any correlation in your data sets between the number of occupants and the size of the apartment, where people, hold on to an apartment because it's very affordable, but they might be a household of one living in a 3-bedroom apartment because they can't find something in the market that meets their housing need for the price?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't collect data in regard to the occupants of the apartments. Usually what's reported is who's on the lease, on the primary lease in regard to renewal in most cases. So we wouldn't have that data.
Do you have in the data sets the sizes of the apartments? 3-bedroom versus 4-bedroom versus studio?
We'd have that on the initial registration.
Initial registration, yeah.
Have we ever, Andrew, have we ever gotten that data just to have a sense of how the unit types fall amongst the 900,000 units?
And no, we never did ask that.
We don't have it.
No, yeah. No, we've never asked for it.
You have a question, Rodrigo?
Going back to Andrew's point about the rent freeze period. In question 41 on overcharge complaints, and you may have this data set, Andrew, but the overcharge cases, maybe from 2014 to now, is that something that we have access to, or year per year basis? From 1997 to now?
Which, I'm sorry,
Sorry,
which?
Question
41.
41. I believe, yeah, we have that, but we may have tracked that. All right. Okay. All right. Okay, thank you.
Did we answer in the questions? Could you just go over, just so everyone on the board understands, when an owner is found guilty of a rent overcharge, what damages the tenant gets?
If there's a finding of an overcharge, the statute presumes that it's willful. Willful means 3 times the overcharge is a penalty. The owner can rebut that statutory presumption of willfulness by the facts in the case. And so if there's a finding that the overcharge is not willful based on particular facts in that case, then interest, simple interest, would be computed using our simple interest calculation system.
Is there any kind of percentage breakout of how many people do get the triple damages versus how many people get just the interest in the overcharge complaints?
We have some sort of breakdown in that area. I don't know, definitely dollar amounts, but I don't know if we have like the number of cases, but we'll see what kind of data we can get you.
We have dollar amounts, we can number of cases.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, we have that info then. All right.
Other questions? It looks like we've exhausted our questions, at least for this morning. Thank you all very much for your presentation, and we look forward to working with you on your outreach with us for our hearings. That will be really
Absolutely.
terrific.
Just give us a date. I'll do one or two myself.
All right.
Wow.
Be careful what you volunteer for.
Woo.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you.
you. Do we need 5 minutes, folks, or can we go right to the mortgage survey? We should push through? Okay. Okay, I think we're ready for the mortgage survey.
Good morning. Good morning. Since the 1980s, the Rent Guidelines Board has been conducting the mortgage survey, which gives a sample view of the lending market faced by borrowers. The board is required by the rent stabilization law to consider the cost and availability of financing in its deliberations. In compliance with the law, each January we send out surveys to financial institutions that underwrite mortgages for multifamily properties in New York City. The survey covers 4 main areas: new and refinance loans, underwriting criteria, non-performing loans, and the characteristics of buildings in lenders' portfolios. Survey findings are collected in the mortgage survey report, which highlights changes in the New York City multifamily lending market during the prior year. The report is divided into 3 main sections: the mortgage survey analysis, which looks at all the respondents; a longitudinal analysis, which looks at only those lenders responding in both the current and prior year; and in addition to the mortgage survey analysis, we also examine rent-stabilized building sales data. Each winter, the RGB surveys institutions that offer loans for multiple dwelling rent-stabilized properties in the city. The survey is updated annually to include only those institutions that continue to offer new and refinance mortgages. There were 12 responses this year, down 1 from 13 last year, from the 23 surveys mailed, a 52% participation rate. Before going in detail, here is a brief summary of the key findings. Interest rates charged on loans increased. Upfront service fees, which are called points for mortgages, remained unchanged. Vacancy and collection losses declined. Lending volume for new loans also declined. However, it increased for refinance loans. Maximum loan-to-value ratios declined slightly. And in our analysis of building sales data, the number of stabilized buildings sold in 2017 declined. After falling to a record low 2 years ago, average interest rates again increased this year. This year's average interest rate for multifamily mortgages rose to 4.83%, an increase of 57 basis points, or 13% from the prior year. This was the second year of increases after rates fell to a record low in 2016. This graph shows average interest rates charged for new mortgages over the period since the early 1980s. And this graph and all other graphs in this presentation are also in the report in case you want to see it in more detail. The graph illustrates that interest rates were once significantly higher, residing in the double digits throughout the 1980s, then fell to single digits in the 1990s. And 2 years ago, average interest rates declined to their lowest level in this survey's history. But as I said, they've increased over the last 2 years to 4.83% this year. Points? Yes.
Brian, so this is kind of a big question, and I don't know if it can be answered now. But in thinking about the use of this information to us, I wonder, instead of, or in addition to looking at this year's change in mortgage interest rates, would it make more sense to look at a trend of a rolling average, given that current landlords have some mortgages originated this year, last year, the year before, so to have some sense of what the rolling average is to kind of get a sense of what the portfolio interest rate is? And then a related question is, wouldn't we want to have a sense of mortgage terms? A lot of, I think a lot of multifamily mortgages are maybe 10-year terms, or I might be wrong about that, but if we had a sense of both how long mortgage terms were for rent-stabilized buildings and what a rolling interest rate is, would that give us a better sense of what landlord mortgage costs were?
Well, the terms are specified in the appendix for each of the lenders. It's a typical terms. In terms of rolling, I think it's enough to, we're lucky we get results from what they've done in a particular year in terms of interest rates, and it would be tough to assess what the rates are for a number of years, I think.
But we couldn't create a rolling index from the data that you have?
We could look into it.
So you would want to base that on the terms in the back, like the average term. Like if the average term is 10 years, then you would take a 10-year rolling average.
You would or you wouldn't?
No, I'm asking, is that what you would ask?
My intuition is that would make sense, right? So that way, if a large proportion of mortgages have 10-year terms and we averaged interest rates over those 10 years, would that give us a pretty concrete sense of interest or of mortgage costs for landlords?
Just for clarity, 10 is it's more the upper limit. And a lot of these are 5-year, 5 and 7. So 10 would not be the number.
So we could potentially do a term or an adjusted term, and then look at the so if, let's say it's on average 7, and then we look at the rolling interest rates over 7 years. This is a little bit beyond my skill set, but it just seems more reflective of the population of mortgages than just looking at today's interest rates.
Yeah, Scott's absolutely right, by the way. But in general, if you just look at that chart, I think if you took the last 7 years, the interest rates are very stable. So I'm not sure in this time period it'd show much, but maybe in a different time period we could try to do that. But I'm not sure it's going to reveal that much more than what this graph already shows, that they're pretty stable over that time period.
I bet you're right, but I wouldn't be surprised that over the long term that would be a better way to do it, because like when you go from the years of the early 2000s, when they're like 7s down to the 4s, in those transition years, that rolling average will give you a better sense than a 1-year snapshot. It would be my guess.
But probably what's like a little complicated in the idea, though, is we do know in 30 and 40-year trends, we've been at all-time lows. I mean, beyond crazy. And so rates are only going to go up. So your thing is going to smooth it out and kind of underrepresent it in a raising rate environment?
I think you're totally right, but I think for the board going forward, if they did this in the long term, it would give you a more accurate measurement, but in the short term, it may have suffered from the flaw. Yes.
I'll continue. Points, which are upfront service fees, remained unchanged this year after falling to a record low 2 years ago. The average fee charged on new loans by lenders remained at 0.44. Among survey respondents, average points this year ranged between 0 and 1, with 5 surveyed lenders charging no points on new loans. This graph shows the average points charged for new mortgages since the early 80s. After averaging between 1 and 3 points in the 80s and 90s, average service fees have been at or below 1 point for the last 2 decades. And after falling to a record low 2 years ago, they've remained unchanged this year at 0.44. The average volume of new mortgage originations declined from last year to an average of 43 new loans per institution, down from 105 the previous year. A total of 520 new loans were made by lenders in our survey this year. However, the average number of refinance loans rose, increasing 22% over last year to 53. And the total number of refinance loans made by lenders surveyed in our study this year equaled 632.
Is that drop a function of losing the one lender respondent?
Actually, we did lose a larger lender, but there were just fewer building sales this year based on data from the Department of Finance that I'll discuss later. So I think it's probably largely from that.
Yeah, actually, we sort of took a look at that. If they decreased their loans at the same rate as others, it wouldn't have had much impact, because I think there were 60 loans last year they did roughly. So now they would be doing something like 25 loans or something along those lines. Brian and I were talking about it and figuring it out. So I don't think it had that much of an impact on the number of loans. The average actually would have been brought down a little, I think.
So Brian, do we know how many of these refinances were cash out?
No, we don't have specifics, no. This year's lenders, on average, maintain lending practices that were similar to the prior year. For all institutions, the typical maximum LTV ratio, the maximum dollar amount respondents were willing to lend based on the building's value, ranged from 60 to 82.5%. The average was 73.5%, down slightly from the prior year's 73.7%. The debt service ratio, which is NOI divided by debt service, was virtually the same this year, with an average debt service requirement of 1.23 versus 1.22 the prior year. Overall, just one surveyed lender reported making changes in their underwriting standards since last year. This graph illustrates lenders' standards for maximum loan-to-value ratios over the last 23 years. This year, as I mentioned, the LTV ratio stood at 73.5%, down slightly from the prior year. The survey asks lenders whether their lending standards differ for rent-stabilized buildings versus non-stabilized multifamily properties. Respondents were asked whether their new financing rates, refinancing rates, loan-to-value ratios, and debt service coverage requirements for stabilized properties were higher, lower, or the same as for other properties. While the majority of lenders reported no difference, one lender reported higher financing and refinancing rates, and another lender reported more conservative debt service coverage for stabilized buildings. By contrast, one lender reported more favorable financing and refinancing rates, two lenders reported better LTV ratios, and another two lenders reported more lenient debt service coverage requirements for stabilized buildings in their portfolios. The proportion of lenders reporting that they had non-performing loans declined this year, from 4 last year to 1 this year, and these loans make up 0.005% of the lenders' portfolios this year. In addition, the same lender also reported foreclosures this year compared to 2 lenders last year, making up 0.002% of their portfolio. The typical size of buildings in surveyed lenders' portfolios varies widely. The most commonly reported building size is 50 to 99 units, with half of lenders reporting this size as typical, while a quarter report that their typical building is 1 to 10 units, and the remainder are within the other categories. Average operating and maintenance expenses and average rents among buildings and lenders' portfolios changed in opposite directions this year. Average rent per unit per month rose 7.1% to $1,281 this year, while average expenses fell 8.4% to $598. Because average rent increased and costs declined, the average cost-to-rent ratio fell from 53.2% last year to 46.7% this year. Average vacancy and collection losses decreased for the 7th time in the last 8 years, down from 2.92% last year to 2.83% this year, the lowest level in the history of this report. All but one surveyed lender this year reported that buildings in their portfolio contain commercial space, though the average number varies depending on the lender. On average, lenders report that 35% of their portfolios contain commercial space, about the same as last year. This graph illustrates vacancy and collection losses over the last 23 years. Vacancy and collection losses have fallen over the last 5 years, including this year, declining to 2.83%. And as I mentioned, that's the lowest level that we've measured in this survey. The survey asks lenders about the performance of their portfolios compared with expectations at the time of initial loan origination regarding NOI, debt service coverage, and O&M expenses. A majority of lenders reported that their expectations had been met or exceeded in all areas among their stabilized portfolios. Specifically, at least 83% said that this year their expectations were equaled or exceeded among all 3 categories. That's an increase from the prior year when 2/3 said the same thing. The survey also asks lenders whether they retain their mortgages or sell them to secondary markets. Among the lenders, all but 3 lenders reported retaining all their mortgages, about the same proportion as last year. Now we'll move on to the longitudinal analysis, which examines findings among institutions that responded to the survey both last year and this year. All of this year's lenders responded last year as well, and thus all lenders are part of our longitudinal sample. The average interest rate among the longitudinal group for new loans as of February 2018 was 4.83%. That was an increase from the year earlier when the average interest rate among the same group was 4.3%. 36%, excuse me. Among the longitudinal group, average points offered by lenders declined from last year, falling from 0.48 to 0.44. The average and maximum loan-to-value ratio remained unchanged this year, remaining at 73.5%. The average debt service ratio was little changed, up from 1.22 last year to 1.23 this year. And like the main mortgage survey analysis, vacancy and collection losses among the longitudinal group declined to 2.83% this year from 3.13% last year. And looking at the rate of delinquencies among the longitudinal group, one lender reported non-performing loans and foreclosures. Now we'll move on to analysis of the rent-stabilized building sales data. A decade ago, the New York City Department of Finance began offering online public property sales information. Using this data, we have analyzed rent-stabilized building sales data in each of the last 10 mortgage survey reports. This year, we follow up with a look at data from calendar year 2017 and compare it to the prior year. In 2017, 793 buildings containing rent-stabilized units were sold in the city, a 32% decline from the prior year. Each borough saw sales volume decline, though at differing proportions. In Manhattan, sales fell the most, falling 43%, while in the Bronx, sales declined 33%. In Queens, they were down 24%, and in Brooklyn, sales fell the least, declining 23%. And as in prior years, Staten Island is not included in this analysis because there are too few stabilized building sales in the borough. Of the 793 buildings reported to have been sold in 2017, they represent 66% of the number of buildings that received new mortgages, as reported in our surveyed lenders this year. Looking at sales data by building size, sales change varied. Among the smallest size rent-stabilized buildings sold, 6 to 10 unit buildings, sales volume was down 18% citywide. Among 11 to 19 unit buildings, it fell 36%. Among 20 to 99 unit buildings, sales volume declined 41%, and among the largest size buildings containing 100 or more units, sales volume fell 62% from the prior year. This graph illustrates that over the last 15 years, sales peaked in 2005 when 1,816 rent-stabilized buildings were sold citywide. However, by 2009, sales volume declined to 521 buildings. Since then, sales volume increased most years, but has declined over the last couple of years to 793 buildings, 32% less than the prior year. Now we'll shift to an analysis of sales prices of buildings in 2017. Citywide, the median sales price was $3.8 million. The highest median sales price was in Manhattan at $8.3 million, followed by the Bronx at about $4.2 million, Brooklyn at $2.1 million, and Queens at about $1.7 million. Looking at sales prices by building size, among the smallest buildings, 6 to 10 units, median sales price citywide was about $1.5 million. Among 11 to 19 unit buildings, median prices were about $3.7 million. Buildings with 20 to 99 units sold at a median price of $9 million. And among the largest buildings containing 100 or more units, they sold for a median price of $35 million. So, to sum up this year's mortgage survey report, interest rates rose, service fees remained unchanged, and vacancy and collection losses fell to the lowest level in this survey's history. In addition, the number of stabilized buildings sold declined from the prior year. Thank you, and I'll now take any more questions you might have.
I have a question on the citywide building sales. That's just number of buildings, not number of units.
Correct.
It's interesting because when Stuytown sold in 2006, there's a drop there. But could this ever be done based on number of units? Do you have the data to do that?
We have units, yes.
Can we just see this chart based on units, just to have a sense of how?
Sure, we can do that.
Scott, do you have any thoughts on why median sales prices are flat or down? Do you have any, I'm just noticing, if you look at Appendix 8, that citywide median sales prices are down or flat.
I mean, I think the adage is things are coming off all-time highs, and the market is trying to recalibrate. So it may take a couple years of drops before we can have enough growth to support those prices. I think the past prices were just unsupportable.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe you have to look at it every building, but
Mm-hmm. Any other questions for Brian? No. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we're going to talk about that for just 1 second. Given that we've lost folks, should we defer till next week?
Yeah, we'll have
okay.
time probably after
Yeah.
the owner testimony to do it then, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to defer discussion of the memos to next week because we've lost some folks.
Yeah, we'll have time. There's usually time before lunch. After the group in the morning goes, we'll probably have a half hour, 45 minutes before lunch. If you have not given your menus in, please do so before you leave.
The sign-in sheet are here.
The sign-in sheet. Rodrigo, I have your menu here actually, because you came in late. So we're buying lunch next week because it's an all day. No, we have two more that we do, the housing supply report and the changes of the stabilized stock. So they'll be presented at the May 24th meeting.
Okay, any further business?
So just to confirm that we are posting the schedule as is?
Yes.
Okay.
We need to get that out so folks can organize themselves.
Understood. I get it.
Okay, great.
We have the right to, we reserve the right to change, so.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right, do I hear a motion to adjourn? And a second? Scott, thank you. Or we're adjourned, thank you.